All right, good afternoon. I'm going to be recording a presentation that answers some student questions. These student questions were all from A World from Dust, chapters 1 through 6, in the context of our physical chemistry class. So let me show you. The class number is 3410. The time is spring 2022, and this is a continuing series of just answering people's questions. I asked for a question and a comment, and we got more than I asked for. I'm going to try to answer all of them relatively quickly. But of course, for you students, if you still have questions after I answer your question, please go ahead and give me more questions because I like doing this. So let's just move through in order. Took the questions and I edited them slightly, and I put them in order from chapters 1 through chapter 6. So starting off, we have a question about arsenic DNA. And the idea is, if arsenic really can take the place of phosphate in DNA, is it possible to make the double helix exist to stabilize the structure? And the answer is yes. You can actually have the double helix exist. The question is not whether the double helix can exist in the first place. The question is, how long can it exist before it falls apart? Because remember that all of these biomolecules are in the context of constantly moving water. And water is a pretty reactive substance. It can react with things, it can hydrolyze a lot of things, and it makes a lot of things break down. So the fact of the matter is, arsenic is enough like phosphate that it can actually adopt the same geometry, it can adopt the same angles, and the double helix is based on that angle. But once it's formed, can the double helix survive at all? And to my knowledge, nobody's been successful at, even in a lab, with all of the efforts of the lab going into keeping the double helix together. You can't keep the arsenate backbone together in water long enough to even measure it. One example, this came out a couple years ago, about some people did a computer study of what would happen if you had arsenic in the place of phosphate in a DNA double helix. And they calculated, of course, they were able in the computer to build the structure of the double helix exactly like what we have, and that makes sense. The problem is it would fall apart. In the presence of water, water would attack the arsenate bonds and would cause them to completely fall apart. And it would happen really quickly. One of the reasons this doesn't happen for phosphate is that there's a certain resonance stability that happens in the phosphate bonds that does not happen in the arsenate bonds. And this is something that chemists who work with arsenate and phosphate sort of know intuitively. That's why they had the reaction when the Arsenic Life paper came out. This can't be real, because how are you going to keep these bonds together? Not how will you make them in the first place, but how will you keep them together? The other question is, if you could have this, and if you could somehow stabilize it, maybe you could add a molecule to stabilize it. I don't know. Is there anything that would prevent it from undergoing transcription? And actually, this question puts its finger exactly on what would be the issue here. The arsenate backbone would be more sticky, potentially, to the RNA polymerase. That's certainly a possibility. I mean, the fact of the matter is the phosphate bonds, you have the polymerase is tuned to be able to bind tightly enough to be able to move down the road, but not so tightly that it stays stuck in place. It's very possible that the balance of charges with arsenate would be off, so that it would be more sticky or maybe less sticky. Maybe it would never stick in the first place. I don't really know how it would be different until we actually run the simulations or things like that, but they would have to be simulations because you cannot get arsenic DNA to even persist in the test tube. If I'm wrong about that, and there's a article that shows different, I have not been able to find it. I would be very interested to know if somebody actually was able to do that. So there's just another comment about how we talked about how magnesium and ATP, phosphates, those things sort of go together like peanut butter and jelly. The magnesium fits into the double phosphates, the triple phosphates that you have. And so there's this was another point, that if you dysregulate magnesium, you actually have a dysregulation of this entire processes of the cell that involve phosphate in one way or another. And that's actually, it looks like this comment about the physiological importance of magnesium is related directly to this biochemical structural fact that magnesium fits right into the phosphates, between two phosphates like in ATP. So chapter 2, we started talking about electrons and nodes and antinodes. And yes, it's the one thing I have to say is that we have hardly any time in this class to really talk about the physics of what's going on. For that, we have a whole class that talks about quantum mechanics, and that's a 4-credit class that you're welcome to take, I believe, but I think that probably you don't have time to take it. So I'm happy to answer this question, but I'm going to have to show you a little bit of math because that's the answer to this question. Everything that we're talking about here is where they've observed something in the lab. They've observed how big electrons are, how electrons behave. And then they've worked out that the kind of math that explains how electrons behave is three-dimensional wave math. The thing about wave math is it's not taught that much. Maybe you learn a little bit about sines, cosines, things like that. And that's actually where you start. But you don't really get to three-dimensional calculations until Calculus 3, which is beyond what this class requires. So the issue is that we can't really show you the math because the math is beyond what we require for this class. So the question is, what do nodes and antinodes mean when it comes to electrons? And there's a little bit, I want to clarify something in this question, because this question sort of takes orbitals and electrons as being similar. But orbital is the shape that an electron takes. It's the shape that the electron wave can adopt. And the way to look at it is the orbital is the map of where the electron can be. If you have this electron going around this nucleus with this energy, there's only a certain number of places it can be. And as you add in electrons, they move to higher and higher energies. And therefore their orbitals also have the maps of where they can go. They can go to higher and higher energy places. What that means, remember that these are all tied, these are all constantly being pulled in by the nucleus, by the positive charges in the nucleus. So you've got the electron constantly, it's got its wave properties where it's constantly moving around, and yet it is constantly tied to the nucleus. That's what makes chemistry happen. The fact that usually an electron is tied to the nucleus. If you have enough energy, you can move it off over here. But it's hard to do because it's naturally attracted negative charge to positive charge. So what do nodes and antinodes mean? Well, this is where you work out the wave math. And the wave math that you've probably been exposed to is one-dimensional wave math. A sine x function is a one-dimensional wave. This wave has nodes and it has nodes. It doesn't have antinodes. That's a little bit beyond the concept, but I think the concept of nodes is what we can handle here. A node is anywhere where the sine x function equals 0. So you can see here it goes up and down. You have a positive part, a negative part. Wherever it hits 0, there's a node because the value is 0 at that point. The value is related to whether the electron can be there or not. So if you have a one-dimensional wave, whether the electron can be there, the probability that the electron will be at that location is the square of the wave function. So it's related to whether the sine of x is between +1 or -1. If it's a number, then the electron can be there. But the cool thing about waves is, of course, they cross the 0 line. And since the number is where the electron is, the node, if the number equals 0, the electron can't be there. Now, this is the fact that the electron can't be where the number equals 0 has to do with the whole wave math thing. You're going to have to sort of trust me on that. But at least here you can see where the nodes are and what we're talking about with a one-dimensional wave. Three-dimensional waves are just the same math done in 3 dimensions, but like we said, Calculus 3 is beyond the scope of this class. But three-dimensional waves are like one-dimensional waves, but they have characteristics where they also have nodes. It's just that the nodes, instead of being along a straight line, the nodes are spheres in this case in 3-dimensional space. So the 2s electron actually has 2 lobes, the yellow and the blue, and between the yellow and the blue there's actually a place where the function equals 0. If the function equals 0, the electron cannot be there. You will never see the electron there, no matter how much you look, no matter how quantum mechanical it is. And this is the point I want to make. Quantum mechanical electrons, you don't know exactly where they are, but you can know exactly where they aren't. And that's where the nodes are. So if you look at this, the nodes in 3s, as you go up to higher levels, the 3s has more nodes than the 2s, which has more nodes than the 1s. The higher you go in energy, the more nodes you have. And that's the same concept of 1D wave. The higher you go in energy, the more it ripples, right? And the more it crosses the zero line. So the more it moves around the wave function in this sense, the more nodes it has. And that's the main point. These, as you move up in energies for the electrons, they get more and more twisted in a sense. Here's some 3D electrons, and you can see those have 4 lobes, and they have lots of nodes. There's nodes between the lobes where the lobes are just about touching. There's places where the electron can never be. And I just want you to see, just imagine that this is like a one-dimensional case where you have more ripples up and down. Instead, you have more ripples in 3-dimensional space rather than one-dimensional line. Okay? The only other thing is that we do all this by seeing how electrons behave. And it turns out that electrons have, you can describe exactly how an electron behaves if you have 4 numbers. The first 3 numbers determine this wave function right here. But then there's a 4th number, which can be either up or down. It can be one value or another value. So they called this number, it's the angular momentum. They called it the spin of the electron. It's not exactly spinning, but again, we have to deal with math here, and we don't have the math, so we can think of it as spinning. Because you can spin one way or you can spin another way. Spin is something that can adopt one of 2 values, if you think of a little spinning top. And so that works for this number of the electron. Because the first 3 numbers of the electron determine the orbital shape, this 4th number, you can have 2 possibilities, and they both are in the exact same orbital. In fact, they can coexist. We can distinguish them, and they can both fit into the same shape. And so what you have is you have the case of quantum mechanics, and if you keep asking why, I'm going to have to get to the point where I say, well, the math tells us why. And you've got to have calculus 3 and wave function and linear algebra before you can do the math. And so at some point you sort of have to trust the people who've done it. We're sort of reaching that point right here. But the important thing is the orbitals and nodes are related to the orbitals, which is where the electrons can be. Because there is this property called spin, there is just this rule. 2 electrons can fit into each orbital, and they don't get in each other's way. No more than that, but that's what can happen. So here's a question about chapter 2, my favorite graph in the whole book. If I had to pick one graph that I would say exemplifies the whole book, it is this graph right here. So I'm very glad you asked a question about this. Now, all the ions, notice very well that all the ions have a +2 charge. And that's because to make this a simple enough graph to be able to see in one dimension on the x-axis, right? We had to simplify it somehow. And so what this does is this takes 6 things that are very similar. They all have +2 charge. They're all transition metals. And so they're all only changing in their d electrons. They aren't changing in any other electrons. They're just having more or fewer d electrons. So it's a very simple case. And it shows for that very simple case, even for these 6 very different elements, you get a reasonable pattern that works for binding nitrogen, sulfur, and oxygen in any combination. This is the kind of thing that comes close to being what we would call a law. Now realize that we're not talking about like a physical law. It's a chemical law, and there's some people who argue over whether we should even use that. But for making chemical laws, we have to limit ourselves somehow. And the limiting factor for which we can see this pattern is that we're limiting ourselves to the middle of the periodic table, only +2, only top row, but when we go across that way, we do see this pattern. So I've just got to say this is our way of limiting a complex situation. But this is universal. This is so common that I think it's fair to call it a chemical law. And I could probably have this argument with people over whether I can or not. So this is just sort of the way chemical laws work. So if you just look at the +2 charge, yeah, zinc and calcium should have the same stickiness and copper should have the same stickiness. But These are all the same, and they are different in terms of d electrons. And so what this is this some sort of d electron effect. This is some sort of effect to the fact that you have more d electrons, which are not on the outside. They have those weird high energy shapes, and so they have directions as well. But the whole thing that this is saying is that these will be very much the same. But not only are within the set, which you would expect them to be very much the same, even within that set you can see a trend. So that's I hope that that gets at the thing that you're asking here. You're right that all +2 should be similarly sticky. Anything that's +3 is going to be off the chart as far as binding strength. Anything that's +1 is probably going to be below the chart as far as binding strength. But we want to make one chart that we can understand, and so we limit ourselves to just what's +2, and within that set, we actually do see these differences that make sense. They go up and then they go down, and it's ordered by the periodic table. Because it is chemical, because it's related to these fundamental universal properties of the atoms, this graph should hold on any water-based planet. And there's also abundance is actually another issue. Abundance is a different graph in the same chapter. So your question about abundance, yes, we need another graph for abundance. So yeah, life's still pretty complicated, but it's amazing that it can even be this simple. As long as we follow these rules and we look at this. The amazing thing about this is I want to point out not just that there's 6 elements along the x-axis, but there are 3 elements, the 3 most common binding partner elements. So this covers a lot of possible chemistry right here. Transition metal chemistry binding to the S, the N, and the O of the CHON elements. And by the way, it won't really bind to C, so this is essentially covering the most prominent binding interactions, like 95% of all possible binding interactions, at least, probably more than that, depending on how you define it. So yes, good reasoning. Think these things through and compare this to the other graphs that we have, like the abundance graph is another graph to consider. We can only consider one thing at a time. So our brains can only hold one thing. That's what I have right here. Moving on to chapter 4. This is a really interesting question. This basically is a question. It notes that there's a lot of methane on Titan. Methane traps heat very efficiently. So definitely methane is warmer than it would be without methane. The only thing is it would be probably about as cold as Pluto, which is incredibly frozen, or as cold as one of the other moons, I suppose, without that much methane. Titan's going to be warmer than the other moons that are going around that don't have as much methane, because the methane is indeed acting as a greenhouse gas. It's going to be trapping heat in some way, I assume. But you've got less heat to trap. You're so much out farther from the sun, you're collecting less of a percentage of the sun's energy that gets all the way out there. Basically, the sun's energy is a sphere, and the sphere is so much bigger when you get out to Titan that you're getting a smaller angle of the sphere as opposed to what the Earth's getting. And so, because it's so much farther out, you're getting less energy in the first place. And I believe that's enough. I don't believe there could ever be enough energy. You could never have enough methane to trap enough energy to make Titan truly hot enough for water-based weather and life. So that's a very good question. You got to remember these are systems that are based on a number of factors. But the fact that you're asking that question means that you're putting the system together in your head, which is really good. Now, this is an idea. Can we send methanophages to Titan to experiment with how they could conquer the planet? They certainly would have enough to eat. The methanophages evolved on Earth, however, would be dependent on water. So we'd have to evolve them in other solvents or figure out. And I don't know if we could ever do that. But if we could, they would have a meal. They'd have a bunch of meals to eat right there. There's enough problems with terraforming Mars, and there's even a board game based on that. I don't know if you're into board games. But terraforming Titan would be a board game like terraforming Mars, but it would have certain challenges, especially because we would have to have everything working in a methane solvent, things like that. But it's a fascinating thing to think about. So I want you to be thinking like this. This is good ways to think. There's more questions about Titan. Everyone wants to talk about Titan. I think it's a fascinating place, so I'm very glad to talk about it. Is it possible that the solar wind will eventually melt and vaporize the methane, like blow it away from the surface of Titan? And it depends on the interplay between the solar wind, the energy, the heat that it provides, as well as the pushing of the solar wind, I suppose, might have an effect. And the gravity is the counteracting force. So as usual, you're talking about a balance between two forces. The gravity of Titan is probably able to hold on to a lot of its methane. I don't know exactly where that balance lies, whether Titan is slowly leaking away methane or not. But also there's the methane, if the methane is made liquid or solid, that sort of helps to hold the methane onto Titan as well. You just got to remember when we're looking at all the planets of the solar system, a lot of different things can happen when it comes to the gaseous atmosphere. You can have Earth, where we've had it, the Goldilocks just right sort of planet. You have Venus, where it holds onto too much of its atmosphere and then it heats up and goes crazy. Then you have Mars, where it's not able to hold on to enough and the atmosphere is stripped. That's for the carbon dioxide on Mars, that's for the carbon dioxide on Venus. We have a mix of gases on Earth, so you've got to consider all these factors when you consider how could I answer this question more thoroughly. But the first thing I'll say is, plot it out as the forces. Just remember there's a force the gravity is keeping the methane onto Titan, as well as the solar winds trying to push it away. And if oxygen is found on Titan, is it possible to explode Titan? Well, this is the kind of question that is really, this is like one of those what-if questions. And if there's enough oxygen, the thing is, for a combustion reaction to work, we are used to explosions, combustion reactions that take place in 20% oxygen, because that's what we've evolved for. And I am a little bit worried that I just lost my thing here. Okay, I think we're still going, so let's go ahead and see. Hopefully it actually did catch it. I don't know why it's closing now. Sorry about this. But hey, we're a small class, so we can deal with it. All right. The idea of explosions. Now, the thing about an explosion is you have the worst kind of explosion is where not only does the reaction happen, but the reaction causes another reaction to happen. You'd have to have a lot of oxygen on Titan for one explosion to give energy to another oxygen to explode, another oxygen to combine with the methane and to explode. And so I don't think there's enough oxygen. I think you'd have to get close to like 10-20% of oxygen for that to be able to happen. But this is a fear. In the Manhattan Project, when they exploded the first nuclear bomb, they were afraid that it could possibly cause a chain reaction of explosions that would give enough energy over from oxygen combining with other things, combusting, for another oxygen to combine, for all the oxygen in the atmosphere to eventually combine. And in fact, that's the principle on which the bomb was built. So of course they were worried about that. That's what they were trying to do with the bomb. So is it possible to explode Titan? Probably not enough oxygen, but there's some sort of calculations. There's a point to where at least it's theoretically possible that all the oxygen in the atmosphere could react and combust. And that would be a bad point. You want to stay away from that point, obviously. There's a final question about, is it possible? And basically the answer to this final question, is it possible that, the polypeptides could be produced? And this puts something on the moon, but I think it's more likely on meteorites, but it's pretty much, the same. The question is whether the chemistry is possible. And I believe that there is some of the chemistry is possible, but again, is there enough chemistry possible to join the bonds versus the chemistry possible to break the bonds apart? And so that's the big thing, that there is energy, there is nitrogen, there is the possibility of forming chains. There's definitely the possibility of forming a lot of amino acids, which are bonds within like 12 to 20 atoms that are bound together into an amino acid. That definitely can happen. And the question is, going a step further, can two amino acids come together? Yeah, probably. But the really big question is, can enough amino acids come together to form a big long chain? And once that happens, is it just random, or could that be shaped somehow by the environment to be a particular sequence that would have a particular function? Each step that we go up it's like the answer is yes, but it becomes less probable. And so polypeptides are possible, but they're less probable. It looks like amino acids are probable enough that there's meteorites that are just rich with them. But the meteorites, from what I understand, are not rich with polypeptides. So it looks like polypeptides are possible, but not likely under the outer space conditions like we're talking about. So moving on to chapter 5, does alchemy really exist? And this is where I talked about, in a sense, yes. You know, the alchemy that the thing is, they didn't have the definitions of science and non-science like we do right now. And they didn't really separate even fact from opinion. And there's issues with doing that today that we have. I don't want to say that there is a clear line. I think that they were right that there are issues separating fact from opinion. And there's issues separating chemistry from alchemy. But there was some good chemistry that took place when you did alchemy. You find out that you mix two things together and you make a color. So the researchers that did this, they are a little bit like alchemists if they just tried stuff and mixed it together and then kept what worked. Alchemy is sort of mixing stuff together but not really knowing why. And there's always a little bit that we don't know why. We know more now in chemistry about the why. And in fact, we can even predict that something else will happen. That's when you really know why. But at the basis, we are always tied to reality. And we're always saying, does alchemy really exist? Well, you know, what's the line between alchemy and chemistry? There were a lot of things that they got wrong in alchemy. But what I show in the book is that there's some things they got right. And I don't think it's fair for us just to say that alchemy never existed. At some points, alchemy did exist and did actually produce a bright product, but it was mixed in with a lot of BS, basically. We need Circe from Eternals. That would be really nice to have Circe from Eternals, but yeah, I agree with that. So I need to see Eternals, but I know enough about Marvel to know what Circe does. And I think that the Circe is sort of a longing, like an extrapolation of wouldn't it be nice to have these powers, you know, that kind of thing. So chapter 5, the origin of life chapter, it didn't mention phosphorus that much. There's a little bit of phosphorus in there, but there's not enough. And yeah, I sort of said to myself, I thought about putting phosphorus into chapter 5 because it is important. I mean, I start off chapter 1 with saying how important it is, right? But the thing is, origin of life is hard enough to work out for CHON elements. Phosphorus is kind of the next level up, and phosphorus's availability is still a puzzle. How did we have enough phosphorus to be able to build phosphorus-based life? In fact, in my opinion, the lack of phosphorus is one of the things that makes me think that an RNA world is less likely than a metabolism-first world, because the metabolism-first world requires less phosphorus. RNA requires a bunch of phosphorus to happen. And that's one of the things, because I think phosphorus is harder to deal with in origin of life than CHON. Not impossible, and there are some people that have thought about it. But you have to think about the abundance. The abundance of phosphorus is so much less than CHON. It's bigger, there's less of it, it's also less soluble. And so it's just too complicated. Maybe in the revised edition I can have a whole nother chapter about origin of life phosphate chemistry, because obviously it is important. But this is a really good catch, and there are some people who study the field who want to study phosphorus precisely because it's so important. These are the people who like to go after the hard problem, right? The hard part of the problem, rather than the easy problem. Relative to CHON, phosphorus is harder, okay? And is that the last of this? Yeah, I think I went through these so quickly and I got a little distracted by the end. So hopefully this recorded well. Thanks for the really great questions. I did go into a little more detail than usual, but that's because these were such great questions. And I hope this helps. These are concepts, especially if you think about these two opposing forces idea. The idea that you have something pushing stuff away, something pulling stuff in. And that can be a lot of physical chemistry we've talked about. In some senses, you can talk about entropy and enthalpy as sort of opposing forces. Sometimes you talk about them working together, but sometimes you talk about the difference between them. And sometimes the bonding energy of like the plus-minus bonding energy, that'd be the enthalpy of the electron binding to the nucleus. But then you have the electron's urge to spread out. And this urge to spread out is sort of, it's wanting to go away from the nucleus. Now, dealing with quantum mechanics is not what we do in this class, and there's a lot of things that I said right then that don't really apply to quantum mechanics, but they would apply to our class when we're thinking about gases and pressure, expansions, entropy, and enthalpy. So I want you to see how all of this physical chemistry, this idea of two opposing forces, is it's a very physics idea, and it's a very physical chemistry idea. And so some of these ideas are going to be on the test. And so I'm glad that you're listening to this. I will go and try to make sure that these are on the test when I go and write it. But of course, you know that the real preview is all of the homework problems that we have that involve entropy and enthalpy. Just try to think of those as, where are the two opposing forces? When we have something that is dynamic but staying in the same place, sometimes there's two forces like pulling at it, tugging at it from different directions. Entropy and enthalpy, maybe the spreading out versus pulling in, gravity versus the solar wind is an idea. So thanks for listening this far. This is a nice preview for the test, and I will see you soon to finish up Chapter 4 this week in class.